In this lesson, we're going to examine the nature of deviance, a topic of some controversy among sociologists, and to me, a topic that graphically illustrates the still youthful character of the discipline, because sociologists are still grappling with what's the most appropriate way to analyze, and for that matter, perhaps even study deviance. And if you'll notice at the bottom of the 14th page of your third study guide, that's as good a definition of deviance as you will find. Deviance is really nonconformity to or violation of approved social norms, rules, laws, regulations. Now, deviance is found in all human societies. It can be thought of, as you note right here, it's universal, but at the same time, it's quite variable. It's going to vary specifically with respect to culture and place. For example, Christianity and Judaism have incorporated as part of religious tradition alcohol to at least one degree or the other. But the faith of Islam strictly forbids all alcohol, including the most mild alcoholic beverages. And although peyote use, buttons off of a particular type of cactus in the Southwest, is illegal throughout the United States, it is permitted as part of the sacraments involved in the Native American church, where it's used to promote healing and self-knowledge. And increasingly deviant in the United States, cigarette smoking is widespread in parts of Europe and likewise the People's Republic of China. People there consume or use more tobacco products than any other country. Or consider this, a practice that's pretty widespread in some cultures, cockfighting. In a number of states in the United States, it is illegal. There have been several attempts in the state of Tennessee in an effort to get the state in line with neighboring states to reclassify cockfighting as a felony, punishable by a $2,500 fine. Currently, the fine is $50, but attempts to reclassify cockfighting as a more serious offense have largely failed because there are some in the state that regard this as part of the state's cultural tradition, and it should not be punished too severely. So, deviance. It's something that falls outside the range of the normal and the expected. But as I mentioned a moment ago, it is highly variable. Take a look again at the fact that definitions of deviance can vary over time, and there are some interesting examples of this. Some of you may know the name Lewis Carroll. He wrote Alice Through the Looking Glass, better known once Disney got a hold of it as Alice in Wonderland. Carroll, again, may very well have copied Alice around a 7-year-old girl by the name of Alice Lindell. Interestingly enough, when Carroll died, his sister was fearful that folks might come to learn that he had a strong sexual interest in the mother of young Alice Littrell. So in a way to save his reputation, the sister started the story that Lewis was actually sexually interested in little Alice. Now, keep in mind that Lewis did his work in the late 1800s. Obviously, at that time, an extramarital affair was considered far more serious than pedophilia. Or, not very long ago, this might have been considered a form of deviance. Yet body piercing is much more acceptable today in our culture than it was in the past. Likewise, there was a time when this would have been considered a form of deviance. Yet today, women have entered into a variety of different fields that were once largely dominated by males. So over time, deviance can change. What was deviant one time may not be deviant in another time. Good example of this. In the United States, some 200 years ago, obesity was accepted as a sign of affluence and the ability to afford large amounts of food. Quite different today. Furthermore, shacking up, that's what we called it when I was young, cohabitation, living together prior to marriage, is another classic example of how deviance changes over time. In the 50s and early 60s, that was an absolute no-no. You just don't do it. But today, it's pretty common. Furthermore, what is quite common today that was not when I was a youngster in the late 50s and early 60s is the open discussion of sexual behavior. The very word condom, you never heard that mentioned when I was young. So again, deviance can change over time. Furthermore, definitions can vary based upon the person or the group performing the act. For example, what if this gentleman showed up at the board meeting of his foundation dressed only in a raincoat, jumps up on the table in the boardroom and exposes himself? Now, cut to a street corner in your own hometown. You encounter this gentleman at a stoplight or at a street corner, and he flashes you. Here's my question. Who's more likely to end up being arrested? I think most of you would agree it's going to be this gentleman. This gentleman, on the other hand, would probably get treatment. Bill's been overworked. We give him a little bit of time off. He'll get some counseling. He'll be as good as new. Furthermore, you want to take into account that in some groups, certain forms of deviance may be considered appropriate. Binge drinking is a good example. Now, binge drinking today is marked by a male having 5 drinks in a row or a woman having 4 in a row. Well, in certain groups, help me out a little bit. Is it possible that binge drinking is considered to be appropriate? Remember what we talked about before, that we may join certain groups, and within these groups, we may learn what the larger society views as nonconformity. Well, very much a part of the Greek culture on college campuses is this notion of drinking a whole lot. Furthermore, you can take into account as well something else. In top-rated high schools around the country, students with high IQs might be considered normal, but underachieving students might be considered to be deviant. And when you start talking about drinking, I still think personally in the United States there is this notion that if guys do it, well, that's part of the guy culture, but women really shouldn't do it. Furthermore, you want to take into account as well, definitions are going to vary according to the social context or the situation itself. Now, for example, it's generally considered okay to do nothing at home. But if you stand around a street corner too long and do nothing, I think most of you realize you run the risk of being arrested. Furthermore, if you talk to God in a place of worship, that activity is probably going to be considered, at least generally, as okay, appropriate. But if you talk to God in a classroom, on a bus, in a crowded elevator, or God talks back directly to you, it's entirely possible that you might be considered deviant. It's Also, I think most of you would agree with me, considered part of the role of a soldier, if he or she is in a situation, to kill an enemy in a combat circumstance. But if he or she committed the same act as a civilian, it's going to be considered murder. A good illustration of the context of the situation comes from a real life situation or a real life set of circumstances. It was made into a film, Alive. A Uruguayan rugby team's airliner, and this is a photograph of that airliner, crashed in the Andes while they were flying to their next match. And from the film, this is a pretty good, and it was pretty accurate, how much of the airliner was left. Now the question you want to bear in mind is, how did those who survived the crash make it? Because they weren't rescued for many months. Some of you know the end of this story. The survivors made it by cannibalizing the dead bodies of their companions. This was not an easy task for them. It was one of the most difficult things all of them did. But finally, 3 of the survivors made it out, were able to secure rescue. And these individuals, again, were quite concerned with what they had done. How often would anybody eat human flesh? Well, it's very rare. But in this particular extraordinary circumstances, they had to in order to survive. So, once again, you want to remember that deviance is variable. But you also want to remember something else. And go over to the 15th page of your study guide. Deviance is relative. Something becomes deviant when it's defined as such. Nothing is inherently deviant. Something becomes deviant when people come to the conclusion that, yep, this is deviant. And almost everybody, and I think it's safe to say that everyone deviates. Most behaviors that violate the norms never are socially recognized as deviant. Some of you are probably aware of the fact that it's estimated that only 1/3 of all crimes reported to authorities ever lead to an arrest. The other 2/3 are handled unofficially. And you also want to bear in mind that much deviance is influenced or affected by emotion. It's encouraged by friends, caused by disagreements over norms, like should marijuana be legal? Or it may be the result of conditions in the immediate situation. Good illustration of this. Some people engage in deviance simply out of boredom or in an effort to impress their peers. And you want to add one other key thing. Is it possible to think of some deviance as to be approved? Well, I think some of you know that there are specific time periods in some cultures set aside during which otherwise deviant behavior for this brief period of time is accepted, maybe even encouraged. Such as this event in New Orleans, part of a much larger global activity called Carnival. This is Mardi Gras. People raise real hell there. They do some weird things. Furthermore, I think a lot of you recognize that there are symbolic places of leisure where you can go and temporarily participate in deviance, but it never goes beyond that community, like this place. You've heard the phrase, haven't you? What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Even big business has kind of jumped into the mix, seeking to package and sell certain forms of deviance. They've sought out some young deviants in an effort to anticipate upcoming trends. It's what's sometimes called cool hunting. And you also want to remember that there are particular times beyond Mardi Gras, during which, again, it's okay to kind of let your hair down and be a different person, a little bit along the lines of what Hensland calls a moral holiday. For example, Halloween for me when I was young was far more than waiting for the great pumpkin. We did some weird and crazy things. Furthermore, some of you go to spring break, okay, in Florida or on the Gulf Coast in Alabama, etc. You know, again, that's kind of a time when people can raise some crazy hell. Plus, it's interesting to note how deviant elements crop into everyday behaviors, such as this as a way of selling milk. Or, any of you recognize this group? When they came out in the 70s, they were considered quite deviant. And I think a lot of you understand that a lot of popular music forms originated to one degree or the other within what some would consider deviant subcultures. Well, what I find interesting about KISS, in this day and age, guess what they're advertising? So deviance is relative. Sociologists argue that nothing is inherently deviant. It becomes deviant when it's perceived or defined as such. In the following lessons, we're going to look at some sociological models aimed at providing us with some insights into deviance. See you then.